The King's Road did not welcome strangers after dark. This was the first thing the Gold Cloaks learned when their torchlight caught the figure standing in the middle of the mud-churned road, 3 leagues south of King's Landing, on a moonless night in the third month of Joffrey Baratheon's reign. Sir Alardeem, a man who had drowned infants on the Queen Regent's orders and felt nothing, pulled his horse to a stop and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The figure was armored in black. Not the black of Night's Watch wool, not the painted black of a tournament knight playing its shadow. This was something else entirely, something that absorbed the torchlight rather than reflecting it. The armor had no sigil, the cloak had no color, and the face, if there was one beneath the cowl, was hidden behind a mask shaped like the head of some creature none of the Gold Cloaks could name. 2 points rising like ears, lenses where eyes should be. "Hold," Deem said, though his voice came out smaller than he intended. "State your name and your house." The figure's head turned, slowly, precisely, as though cataloging each of them. 8 riders, torches, short swords, the way Deem's hand hovered near his pommel rather than gripping it, the nervous horse on the left flank, the youngest guard in the back already edging away. "I'm going to need you to take me to whoever's in charge of this city," the figure said. The voice was low, controlled. The accent was unlike anything from the Seven Kingdoms or the Free Cities. Clipped, flat, stripped of ornamentation. The voice of a man who had no interest in sounding threatening because he didn't need to. Deem drew his sword. 6 others followed. They found all 8 of themselves disarmed in approximately 4 seconds. Deem himself was face down in the King's Road mud, with his arm torqued behind his back at an angle that suggested the joint was 1 pound of pressure from ruin, and the masked figure was crouched over him with the specific stillness of a man who had done this 10,000 times and found it only mildly interesting. "Take me to whoever's in charge," the voice repeated. "Please." Bruce Wayne had understood within 45 seconds of arriving in this world that he was in serious trouble. Not the immediate physical kind. The Gold Cloaks had been straightforward. 8 men, medieval training, no firearms, with no tactical coordination beyond draw swords simultaneously. His body had handled them on autopilot while his mind was already doing what it always did: processing, cataloging, building the picture. The picture was alarming. The portal, Ra's al Ghul's Lazarus Pit experiment, the dimensional tear that had swallowed him mid-grapple above Gotham's harbor, had deposited him somewhere with no GPS signal, no satellite uplink, no Alfred on comms. His cowl's heads-up display was running on local sensors only. The air quality was pre-industrial. The stars overhead were wrong, the constellations entirely unfamiliar, which ruled out time travel and confirmed dimensional transit. The road beneath his boots was packed earth and stone, no asphalt, no concrete substructure. The men he'd disarmed carried torches, not flashlights. Steel swords of inconsistent metallurgical quality. He was not in Gotham. He was not on Earth. He was, by every available indicator, in a pre-gunpowder feudal society with a functioning monarchy, a professional military force of mediocre competence, and at least 1 fortified city nearby. He had his belt, 16 batarangs, 4 smoke pellets, 2 explosive gel canisters, rebreather, grapnel gun, largely useless without modern architecture, cape, armor, cowl, his hands, his mind. No resupply coming. He allowed the Gold Cloaks to take him to the city. He could have disappeared into the tree line, but disappearing accomplished nothing until he had information. Information required proximity to power structures. Power structures resided in cities. When King's Landing announced itself first by smell, wood smoke and waste and salt water, and the particular organic rot of 50,000 people living in close proximity without sanitation infrastructure. Then by sound, the low nocturnal hum of a population that never fully slept. Then by sight, and here Bruce felt something he rarely permitted himself anymore: genuine surprise. The castle on the hill was massive, pale stone, 7 towers, torchlight burning at every battlement, and the walls of the city, old, thick, crowded with battlements, were the walls of a place that had survived genuine sieges. Someone had built this to last. He filed it away. He filed everything away. The gold cloaks delivered him to a captain, who delivered him to a commander, who looked at his armor for a long moment and then sent word to the castle. While they waited, Bruce counted exits, identified structural weaknesses in the gatehouse, cataloged the body language of 14 guards, determined that the commander was left-handed and recently injured, noted that the castle's night watch rotation ran on a 40-minute interval, and began, patiently, systematically, learning everything he could about a place called the Iron Throne and the boy who sat on it. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. By dawn, they had put him in a cell beneath the Red Keep. By dawn, Bruce Wayne had already decided the cell was temporary. The kingdom was in crisis, and whoever or whatever was coming from the north was the only thing in this world that actually mattered. He sat cross-legged on the stone floor, closed his eyes, and began to plan. They gave him a cell with a window slit, which was a mistake, not because he could fit through it. The gap was 4 inches wide, barely enough to admit a hand. But the window faced the castle's inner ward, and over the course of the next 72 hours, Bruce Wayne sat at that window slit and watched King's Landing the way he had once watched Gotham from gargoyles, patiently without blinking until the city revealed its nervous system. He cataloged the guard rotations. 40 minutes, as he'd estimated, with a 6-minute overlap during the change. A window of reduced coverage at the northeast stairwell. He watched the servants and learned their hierarchies faster than he'd learned Gotham's criminal organization charts, because unlike organized crime, servants didn't bother hiding their fear. Fear pointed like a compass needle toward power. He watched who the servants feared, and then he watched those people, and within 36 hours he had constructed a functional map of who actually ran this kingdom. It wasn't the boy king. Joffrey Baratheon, he'd gotten the name from a guard who talked too much during meal delivery, was 17, visibly cruel, and surrounded by people managing him rather than obeying him. The Queen Regent, his mother, was the primary power vector. The small council controlled resource allocation, and threading through all of it, invisible and precise as a scalpel, Shuri was an intelligence apparatus that Bruce recognized immediately because he'd spent 20 years building one. Someone in this castle ran an information network. On the second day, the door opened and a man walked in who was not a guard. He was soft in the way that dangerous men sometimes are. Round-faced, powdered, hands folded placidly before him, moving through the world with the specific comfort of someone who had never needed physical intimidation because he had never lacked for other weapons. He looked at Bruce with small, sharp eyes that were doing exactly what Bruce's eyes did. Cataloging, assessing, building the picture. "You are not from any land I know," the man said. His voice was gentle, precise, faintly accented. "And I know of quite a few." "You run the intelligence network," Bruce said. Not a question, a small smile. "So they call me the Master of Whisperers, Lord Varys." He settled onto the cell's single stool as though it were a throne. "You disarmed 8 gold cloaks in under 5 seconds. You carry weapons that none of my little birds have ever described or drawn. Your armor is unlike any steel forged in the known world." He tilted his head. "And you've been watching the ward through that window slit for 2 days without sleeping, which suggests either extraordinary discipline or that you don't actually need sleep. And given everything else, I'm genuinely uncertain which." "I sleep," Bruce said. 4 hours. In shifts." Military training?" "Something like that." Varys studied him with undisguised curiosity and something that might have been, in another man, delight. "You're mapping us," he said. "Aren't you, right now?" "You've been mapping us since they brought you in." Bruce said nothing. "The guard rotation," Varys continued pleasantly, "the servant hierarchies, the power structures. You've been conducting an intelligence assessment of the Red Keep from a cell with a 4-inch window, and you are, if I'm not mistaken, largely finished." He paused. "How did we do?" Bruce looked at him for a long moment. In Gotham, he'd encountered exactly 3 people who'd surprised him on first meeting. He was looking at the 4th. "You have the best intelligence network I've ever encountered operating without electronic infrastructure," Bruce said. Your master of coin is embezzling at a scale that will destabilize the treasury within 2 years. Your queen regent is competent but emotionally compromised by her son's instability. Your king is a sociopath without the self-awareness to understand his own limitations, which makes him more dangerous than a calculated tyrant because his cruelties are impulsive and therefore unpredictable. He paused. Your dungeons have 3 other prisoners in the eastern wing being held without trial. Your Night's Watch is critically undermanned, and whatever is happening north of a structure called the Wall is being systematically ignored by everyone in this building, despite apparently representing an existential threat to every living person in this country. Silence. Varys's smile had not moved, but something behind his eyes had shifted. The particular recalibration of a man who has just received information that changes the size of the room he thought he was standing in. The Wall, Varys said carefully. Shuri, you know about the Wall. Guards talk, servants talk more. Bruce held his gaze. You have a boy on the Iron Throne, a succession crisis, a continental war beginning, and an invading supernatural army that your entire political class is pretending doesn't exist because acknowledging it would require them to stop fighting each other. He leaned forward slightly. In my experience, that's not a political problem. That's a collapse waiting for a date. Varys was quiet for a very long moment. Outside, the ward sounds continued. Horses, steel, distant shouting, the ordinary noise of a castle that had no idea what was sitting in its dungeon, doing arithmetic on its destruction. I've served 4 kings, Varys said finally. I've sat in councils with the most cunning minds in the known world. Littlefinger, Tywin Lannister, one men who could dismantle a dynasty with a whispered word. He stood, smoothing his robes. I've never had anyone tell me the complete strategic situation of my own kingdom in under 2 minutes from inside a cell. He walked to the door, knocked twice. I'm going to have you moved to better quarters, he said, and then I think we should have a longer conversation. I'll need my equipment returned, Bruce said. Of course. Varys glanced back, and the smile finally reached something genuine. Whoever you are, Lord Batman, Westeros is going to find you very difficult to manage. They won't be managing me, Bruce said quietly. I'll be managing them. Varys was as good as his word, which Bruce noted was itself a data point worth filing. Better quarters meant a room in the castle's lower residential wing, small, stone-floored, in with a real bed and a brazier burning low against the autumn chill. His belt and equipment were returned in a cloth sack, inventoried with unsettling accuracy. Someone had cataloged every batarang, counted the smoke pellets, and left a handwritten note. Elegant, precise script that read simply, fascinating. None of it makes sense. Please don't use any of it on us. Bruce almost smiled. He spent the first hour after Varys's departure doing what he always did when establishing a new base of operations in hostile territory. A full equipment audit. 16 batarangs, 4 smoke pellets, 2 explosive gel canisters. Enough for 2 substantial detonations or 4 smaller ones. Rebreather, grapnel gun, trauma kit, 3 compressed gas capsules. His armor had taken no meaningful damage during the King's Road encounter. The Cowl's analytical systems were running on internal power, good for another estimated 3 weeks before the battery cells degraded without access to a charging infrastructure that wouldn't exist for several centuries. 3 weeks of heads-up display. Then he'd be navigating without it. He added that to the list of problems and moved on. Varys returned that evening with wine. Bruce didn't drink, and information he absorbed like water into stone. The political landscape of Westeros unfolded across the next 3 hours in precise, devastating detail. 7 kingdoms historically united under one throne, now fracturing under the pressure of Joffrey's illegitimacy. Robb Stark's rebellion in the north, Stannis Baratheon's claim by blood, Renly Baratheon's claim by popularity, and Balon Greyjoy's opportunistic resurgence in the Iron Islands. 5 claimants, 1 throne, a continent bleeding itself white. You're describing a failed state, Bruce said when Varys paused. I'm describing Westeros, Varys replied as though these were synonyms. The Night's Watch, Bruce said. Tell me everything. Varys's composure flickered. Not much. the faintest hesitation of a man who had spent decades controlling every micro-expression. You return to that consistently, because everyone else is ignoring it consistently. Bruce set down his untouched wine cup. 5 armies competing for a chair. Meanwhile, something is mobilizing north of an 800-year-old wall that everyone treats as mythology. In my experience, the threat everyone agrees to ignore is the one that kills them. The White Walkers, Varys said carefully. Each are considered by most learned men to be. I don't care what they're considered to be. I care what they are. Bruce leaned forward. You have eyes everywhere in this castle. Do you have eyes at the wall? A pause. Fewer than I'd like. Get me more. Everything. Ranger reports, deserter testimonies, master correspondence from Castle Black. And I need to know about a material called dragonglass. Every reference, every known deposit, every record of its use. Varys studied him with that careful, calibrated attention. You've been here 3 days, he said. You've identified the White Walkers as the primary threat, begun requesting intelligence on the wall, and asked about the only material known to harm them. He paused. How? Because I'm a detective, Bruce said, and detectives follow evidence, not politics. The evidence, when Varys's little birds began delivering it over the following week, was worse than Bruce had calculated. Ranger disappearances accelerating, deserter testimonies, men broken by something beyond cold and darkness, executed for cowardice before their stories could spread. A maester at Castle Black named Aemon, 100 years old, sending ravens to every lord in Westeros and receiving polite silence in return. The wall itself, 700 feet of ancient ice, maintained by a brotherhood of criminals and cast-offs numbering fewer than 1,000 men against an enemy that killed and then recruited its casualties. Bruce mapped it all on parchment, the best available technology, and looked at what he'd built. The Army of the Dead was not a military force in any conventional sense. It was a self-replenishing resource. Every soldier it killed became another soldier. Attrition worked in reverse. Every conventional military strategy, siege, flank, feint, encirclement, failed against an enemy that didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't feel fear, and converted its losses into assets. There was no winning a war of attrition against something that couldn't attrit, which meant the only viable strategy was decapitation. Eliminate whatever was directing the force, or find and destroy the mechanism by which the dead were animated. Neither option was achievable without first understanding the enemy's command structure, and that required intelligence gathering north of the wall itself. He was still working through the implications when the door opened without a knock, and a different kind of problem walked in. Tyrion Lannister was shorter than Bruce expected, with mismatched eyes and the specific bearing of a man who had decided early in life that if the world was going to underestimate him, he might as well make the underestimation useful. He carried wine and looked at Bruce's parchment maps with an expression that moved through surprise, recognition, and something approaching hunger in about 4 seconds. Varys tells me you're either the most dangerous man in the 7 kingdoms or a god who's lost his way home, Tyrion said, dropping into the room's single chair uninvited. He declined to specify which. He looked at the maps. Are those tactical assessments of White Walker movement patterns? Preliminary, Bruce said, watching him, based on ranger reports and deserter testimony that every lord in Westeros has dismissed as fear madness. Tyrion reached for the parchment, stopped himself. He looked up. May I? Bruce nodded. Tyrion studied the maps for a long time, longer than Bruce expected. When he set them down, his expression had changed. The sardonic performance stripped away, leaving something quieter and considerably more serious underneath. You actually believe it, Tyrion said. I believe evidence, Bruce said. The evidence is unambiguous. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. My family controls the largest army in Westeros. My sister sits on the small council. My father is Tywin Lannister. He refilled his wine cup. And none of them will listen to a word about what's coming from the north because they're too busy ensuring the Lannisters win a war that won't matter if the dead reach the Trident. He drank. So, what do you need? Bruce looked at him. Really looked. The way he looked at Gordon, at Lucius, At the rare individual in Gotham who turned out to be genuinely, usefully competent. I need to get to Robb Stark's camp, he said. Robb Stark's war camp smelled like pine resin and blood, and the particular exhausted tension of an army that had been winning battles and losing the war simultaneously. Tyrion's assistance had proven characteristically indirect, not safe passage, which a Lannister couldn't provide to a man riding toward the young wolf's lines, but rather a detailed map, a letter of introduction written in a cipher. Tyrion claimed only 3 people in Westeros could read, and the name of a smuggler operating out of the Riverlands who owed the dwarf a significant debt. The journey north and west had taken 11 days on horseback, which gave Bruce 11 days to study the terrain, assess the agricultural infrastructure, note the refugee patterns flowing away from combat zones, and arrive at Robb Stark's camp with a more complete picture of the Riverlands' strategic situation than most of the young wolf's own bannermen possessed. The Stark direwolf banners snapped in cold wind above a fortified position that demonstrated genuine military competence. Overlapping fields of fire from the archer positions, cavalry staging areas with clear egress routes, supply lines that were well organized if slightly vulnerable on the eastern approach. Whoever was advising Robb Stark knew what they were doing. They brought him to the command tent under guard, which was the correct decision. He approved of it. Robb Stark was younger than the intelligence had suggested and older than his years simultaneously. The particular aging that happened to people who had been handed enormous responsibility before they'd finished growing into their own faces. He sat behind a campaign table covered in maps, a massive gray direwolf lying at his feet, and he looked at Bruce with gray Stark eyes that were assessing, careful, and notably unfrightened. Beside him stood a woman Bruce recognized from Varys's descriptions as Lady Catelyn Tully Stark, Robb's mother, politically experienced, currently his primary counsel. She looked at Bruce's armor with an expression that moved through confusion and settled on wariness. "You're the one they're calling the Bat Knight," Robb said, not mockingly, simply stating it, when the way soldiers referred to things that had entered the common vocabulary of the camp without proper explanation. "Varys's letter says you're not from any kingdom in the known world." "That's accurate," Bruce said. "It also says you have information about the White Walkers." "More than that." Bruce stepped forward, reached into his cape, and produced his parchment maps, the ones he'd been refining for 2 weeks, incorporating everything Varys's network had provided. He spread them across Robb's campaign table, overlapping the existing battle maps. "I have an analysis of what they are, how they operate, and why everything you're currently doing in this war is handing them exactly the conditions they need to win." Silence in the tent. The direwolf raised its massive head and looked at Bruce with amber eyes. "Explain," Robb said. Bruce did. He spoke for 20 minutes without pause. The Ranger disappearance patterns, the self-replenishing army dynamic, the mathematical certainty of Southern collapse if the wall failed, the complete strategic irrelevance of every battle currently being fought in the Riverlands, measured against the existential arithmetic of an enemy that converted casualties into soldiers. He spoke with the flat, precise urgency he used when briefing Gordon on catastrophic threats. The voice that meant there is no time for politics, so hear the facts. When he finished, the tent was very quiet. "You're saying our war doesn't matter," Catelyn said. Her voice was carefully controlled, which meant she was more shaken than she wanted to show. "I'm saying your war matters considerably less than what's coming," Bruce said. Which is a different thing." Robb was looking at the maps. His jaw had tightened. Bruce recognized the expression. It was the expression of a man receiving information that complicated a decision he'd already committed to emotionally. "My father was taken by the Lannisters, executed in front of the city. My sisters are still in King's Landing. I have men who followed me because I promised them justice." "I know," Bruce said. "Then you understand why I can't simply—" "I understand why you feel that way," Bruce said. "I'm telling you what the mathematics require, not what you're capable of choosing emotionally. They're different conversations." He held the younger man's gaze. "You're a good commander. Your tactical record against Lannister forces is exceptional given your age and experience. You understand terrain. You manage your bannermen's egos better than most men twice your age, and your instincts under pressure are sound." He paused. "You are fighting the wrong war." Rob absorbed this without flinching, which elevated Bruce's assessment of him further. "What would you have me do?" Rob said. It wasn't quite a question. "Negotiate," Bruce said. "Not surrender, negotiate. Lannisters, Baratheons, every claimant currently bleeding the continent. Force a temporary cessation of hostilities. Redirect every available fighting force toward the wall. Establish dragonglass weapon production at every castle with smithing capacity between here and Castle Black. The Lannisters will never..." Tywin Lannister is intelligent enough to understand an existential threat when it's explained correctly, Bruce said. Kwan, he simply hasn't had it explained correctly yet. Catelyn spoke carefully. And you believe you could explain it to him. I believe the right information, delivered through the right channels, at the right moment, can change the behavior of almost any rational actor, Bruce said. Tywin Lannister is, above everything else, rational. The silence stretched. Rob looked at his maps, the Lannister positions, the Stark lines, the Riverlands bloodshed that had consumed 8 months and thousands of lives. And Bruce watched him think and recognized what was happening behind those gray eyes. The young wolf understood. He understood completely, and he was going to refuse anyway, because he was 19 years old and his father's head had come off on a scaffold in King's Landing, and there were some debts that arithmetic couldn't settle. "Aaron, I can't ask my men to stop fighting," Rob said quietly. "Not yet. Not without something to show them." Bruce looked at him for a long moment. In another life, in another city, he might have seen a younger version of something he recognized in himself. The decision to honor obligation over strategy, loyalty over logic. He'd made the same choice more than once. He understood it the way you understood a wound you'd given yourself. He rolled up his maps. "Then I need your permission to go beyond the wall," he said. Rob blinked. "Beyond the... I need to see what we're actually facing. First-hand intelligence. I can't build a defense against something I haven't assessed directly." Bruce held his gaze. "And I need Jon Snow to take me there." The wall was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with its size. Bruce had prepared himself intellectually for the scale. 700 feet of ancient ice, stretching coast to coast across the continent's northern throat. A construction project that defied pre-industrial engineering capacity and suggested either lost technology or something closer to magic. He'd processed the numbers, adjusted his expectations, and still stood at its base for a full 30 seconds doing nothing but recalibrating, because there was a difference between understanding a thing mathematically and standing at its foot watching it vanish into low cloud. But the wrongness wasn't the height, it was the cold. Not temperature cold. His armor's insulation handled that adequately, and he'd operated in Gotham winters that would have frozen lesser men solid. This was something else. A quality in the air north of the wall that his Cowl's sensors registered as anomalous electromagnetic interference. A low, persistent signal disruption that had no natural meteorological explanation. Like standing near a transformer, running at frequencies slightly beyond human perception. Something vast and ancient was generating a field, and the wall itself seemed to be the boundary of its influence. He filed it and moved on. Jon Snow had agreed to bring him north with the resignation of a man accustomed to accepting difficult obligations. He was quieter than Bruce had expected. Dark-haired, serious, carrying the particular weight of someone who had been told repeatedly that he didn't fully belong anywhere, and had responded by developing a core of iron determination that he wore turned inward, invisible to casual observation. Bruce noticed it because he recognized it. He'd built the same structure in himself at 8 years old, standing over his parents' bodies on a Gotham street. They traveled with a ranging party of 12 brothers, seasoned men, quiet, moving through the haunted forest north of the wall with the careful deliberateness of people who had learned that noise was invitation. Jon's direwolf, Ghost, ranged ahead like white smoke through the black trees. On the second night north of the wall, Bruce found what he'd come to find. Ghost stopped first. The direwolf went rigid at the tree line. Not the bristling aggression of an animal facing a predator, but something quieter and more disturbing. A stillness so complete, it looked like the animal had simply ceased to process the world. Jon reached for the wolf instinctively. and Ghost pressed against his leg without looking at him, eyes fixed on the darkness between the trees ahead. Bruce's cowl sensors were already screaming. The electromagnetic interference had spiked, the anomalous field he'd been tracking since the wall intensifying by an order of magnitude, localized, directional, coming from the frozen tree line 40 meters ahead. His infrared overlay showed nothing. No heat signatures, no warm bodies. That was the confirmation he'd needed and dreaded simultaneously. "Stop," he said quietly. The ranging party stopped. "What is it?" John said, equally quiet. "Movement. 11 o'clock. 35 meters." Bruce was already calculating. Smoke pellets, batarangs, explosive gel. Finite resources, unknown enemy durability, unknown numbers. "They don't generate body heat." John's hand went to his sword. Turn around them, the brothers were doing the same. The practiced, silent coordination of men who had rehearsed this response enough times that it lived in muscle memory. They came out of the trees like the cold itself had learned to walk. 3 of them, rangers, or what had been rangers, in tattered black Night's Watch cloaks, stiff with frost. They moved with a horrible mechanical fluency, the uncanny valley of human locomotion stripped of its small organic variations. Every step identical, perfectly weighted, utterly without the 1,000 tiny adjustments that living bodies made unconsciously. Their eyes were blue, not figuratively, not the pale blue of a cold climate adaptation. Blue like something burning at the center of a very old and very wrong fire. Bruce processed everything in the first 2 seconds. One, the Night's Watch brothers raised their swords. One of the whites, the dead rangers, crossed 12 meters in a time interval that was biomechanically inconsistent with its apparent physical condition. And Bruce understood immediately that whatever animated these things was not constrained by the structural limitations of the bodies it inhabited. He threw a batarang. It caught the lead white across the throat with the force and precision that would have dropped a human combatant. The white turned its blue eyes toward him with the specific attention of something registering an irritant and kept moving. He filed that. Physical trauma, insufficient. The ranging party was fighting now. Steel on frozen flesh, the horrible sounds of combat against something that didn't react to pain, and that registered damage the way a machine registered damage, functionally rather than experientially. A brother went down. Bruce was already moving, explosive gel on his left hand, placing it on the second white's torso with a controlled strike that kept him inside its reach. The detonation was small, targeted. The white came apart. Bruce stopped, looked at what remained. The animating force, whatever intelligence the blue eyes represented, guttered and went out like a candle. The body dropped and did not move again. Physical trauma insufficient. Explosive force, effective. Filed. Jon Snow killed the third with a stroke that took its head cleanly, then stood over it as it continued to move. Headless, purposeful, terrifying, until Ghost tore the torso apart with focused, deliberate savagery. Dismemberment, also effective. Filed. They stood in the frozen forest, breathing hard. 1 brother down, 3 whites destroyed. "Fire?" one of the surviving rangers said shakily. "They said fireworks." "Fireworks," Bruce confirmed. He was looking at the tree line, at the darkness beyond, running calculations. 3 whites. A scouting party, not an assault. Something had sent them. Something had directed them to this location, with enough specificity to suggest either sensory capacity far exceeding human norms, or a command intelligence monitoring a very large area in real time. He turned to Jon Snow, who was looking at the fallen brother with an expression that had moved beyond grief into something exhausted and ancient. "The things controlling them," Bruce said, "the White Walkers themselves. Where do they command from?" Jon looked at him. "A place called the Lands of Always Winter. Far north. No ranging party has ever—" "I'm not asking about ranging parties," and Bruce said. "I'm asking about the command structure." He looked back at the darkness. "Every army has a hierarchy. Destroy the hierarchy, you destroy the coordination. Destroy the coordination. And the dead stop moving," Jon said slowly. "It's a theory," Bruce said, "but it's the only theory that produces a winnable outcome." He looked at the fallen brother. We need to get back to Castle Black. I need a maester, access to every record on White Walker behavior, and information on where dragon glass deposits are located south of the wall. He paused. And I need to send ravens. To who? Jon asked. Bruce thought of Robb Stark's gray eyes refusing the mathematics. Thought of Tyrion Lannister's expression when he looked at the maps. Thought of Varys threading information through a kingdom like a surgeon, threading a needle through a wound. Everyone, he said. All of them. Every lord, every king, every claimant on every throne. He pulled his cape against the cold and turned south toward the wall's distant glow. Because what's in that darkness doesn't care who sits on the Iron Throne. And it's time someone made that impossible to ignore. The ravens went out from Castle Black on a gray morning that smelled like snow and inevitability. Bruce had spent 4 days in the Maester's library, a cramped, candle-lit room that represented the accumulated scholarly knowledge of 800 years of wall-keeping, and emerged with 3 things: a complete theoretical model of White Walker command hierarchy based on behavioral pattern analysis, a list of every known dragon glass deposit in Westeros, and the absolute certainty that no one in the Seven Kingdoms was going to respond to his ravens with anything resembling urgency. He was correct. The responses, when they came over the following week, ranged from polite dismissal to insulted silence. Robb Stark sent a personal reply that was genuine and regretful and ultimately useless. Stannis Baratheon's master wrote back with theological precision about the Lord of Light's divine plan, which Bruce set aside. Tywin Lannister did not respond at all, honor which was itself a response. The old lion was reading everything and committing to nothing, which meant he was processing rather than dismissing. The one response Bruce hadn't anticipated came not by Raven, but by ship. The message arrived at Castle Black via a Night's Watch brother returning from arranging near the eastern coast. A sealed scroll with a 3-headed dragon pressed into red wax, carried by a Dothraki outrider who had somehow navigated from a port city to the wall's eastern end through sheer terrifying directional confidence. The scroll was written in 3 languages, 2 of which Bruce didn't speak. The third was the common tongue, and it read, "The Mother of Dragons has heard of the Bat Knight. She invites him to Dragonstone. She has dragons. She is told he has answers. She believes they may be useful to each other. Or she does not invite twice." Bruce read it twice. Then he looked at the map. Dragonstone. Island fortress off the eastern coast, former seat of House Baratheon, now apparently occupied by Daenerys Targaryen, who had crossed the narrow sea from Essos with 3 dragons, an army of unsullied soldiers, and the kind of messianic certainty that Bruce had learned, through long experience, to treat as both an asset and a warning sign. Dragons were, by any tactical assessment, the most significant military variable currently active in Westeros. A single dragon, properly deployed, could neutralize an army. 3 dragons represented a force multiplier that changed every strategic calculation he'd been running. The army of the dead was devastating against conventional forces, but conventional forces had never included aerial fire support. He needed to see Daenerys Targaryen. He also needed to very carefully assess Daenerys Targaryen. Dragonstone announced itself from the water as a place that had been designed specifically to be psychologically overwhelming. Black volcanic rock carved into dragon shapes by Valyrian craftsmen dead for a century. Towers twisted into scales and claws. The whole fortress emerging from sea mist like something that had grown rather than been built. Bruce cataloged its defensive characteristics automatically. Natural island position, single viable approach by water, cliff faces that would defeat conventional siege equipment, interior architecture suggesting labyrinthine complexity. Extraordinarily defensible, almost impossible to take by force. He also noted that it was an excellent trap if you were inside it and someone controlled the water. He filed it. Daenerys Targaryen received him in the throne room, which was a tactical choice as much as a ceremonial one. High ceilings, her advisors flanking her. The implicit authority of stone and shadow, arranged to make visitors feel small. She was younger than he'd expected and considerably more composed, silver-haired and violet-eyed, with the particular stillness of someone who had survived catastrophic loss, young enough that it had become structural rather than experiential. She sat in the throne of Dragonstone, and looked at him the way generals looked at battlefield reports, extracting information, processing implications, deciding utility. He recognized the look because he used it himself. Beside her stood a woman Bruce identified immediately as Missandei, translator, advisor, trusted counsel. Behind her, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who had survived too much to be careless, was Sir Jorah Mormont, whose presence at the wall's ranging records Bruce had noted, and whose complicated history with both the Night's Watch and Daenerys he'd thoroughly mapped. "The Bat Knight," Daenerys said. Her voice was measured, precise, the voice of someone who had learned to project authority as a survival skill before she'd learned it as a natural one. "My advisors debate whether you're a sorcerer, an assassin, or something else entirely." "Detective," Bruce said. Her mouth curved slightly. "And what have you detected about us? You're unsullied or excellent infantry and completely untested against an enemy that doesn't respond to pain, fear, or the prospect of death," Bruce said. "Your Dothraki cavalry will be psychologically devastated the first time they charge an enemy that their horses refuse to approach. Your dragons are the only military asset you possess that is categorically effective against the army of the dead. Fire destroys whites, and you currently have no coordinated strategy for deploying them against a dispersed, non-territorial enemy that doesn't hold ground or defend supply lines." He paused. "You've built an army for conquering a continent. The continent is about to become irrelevant." Silence in the throne room. Jorah had gone very still. Missandei was watching Daenerys with careful attention. Daenerys looked at him for a long moment. Bruce watched her process the information the way he'd watched Tyrion and Varys process it. The same sequence of surprise, resistance, and reluctant mathematical acceptance. But there was something additional in Daenerys that he hadn't seen in the others. Something that complicated his assessment considerably. She believed she was destined for this. Not arrogantly, genuinely, structurally, in the way that some people carried religious conviction. She had survived fire, survived the death of her husband and child, survived exile and slavery and betrayal, and she had interpreted that survival as evidence of divine purpose. Bruce understood the psychology. He'd encountered it before, in Gotham, in men and women who had survived things that should have destroyed them and emerged with an absolute certainty about their own significance. Sometimes they became the best heroes he'd ever worked alongside. Sometimes they became exactly what they'd fought against. "You want my dragons," Daenerys said. "I want your dragons deployed against the correct enemy before there's no one left to conquer," Bruce said. "What you do with the Iron Throne afterward is your business. And if I want something in return?" "You want the White Walkers defeated," Bruce said, "because a queen of ashes ruling a kingdom of the dead isn't a queen. It's a monument." He held her gaze. "Help me build the coalition that stops what's coming from the north, and I'll help you navigate the politics that follow. I know where every lord's leverage point is, which alliances are structurally viable, and which conflicts can be resolved without bloodshed if managed correctly." Daenerys studied him with those violet eyes that were doing considerably more analytical work than they appeared to be doing. "You could help me take the Iron Throne," she said carefully. "I could help you decide whether taking it is actually what you want," Bruce said, "or whether it's simply what you've been told to want for so long it feels indistinguishable from genuine desire." The throne room went very quiet. Jorah made a small sound that might have been alarm. Daenerys looked at Bruce with an expression he couldn't fully read, which was unusual enough to be significant. And then she said quietly, "I think you may be the most dangerous person I've ever met." "I've been told that," Bruce said, "usually by people who then tried to use me. I'd recommend against it." The Red Wedding was 31 days away. Bruce knew this because Varys's little birds were everywhere, and information, properly assembled, became prophecy. He knew the location, the twins, with the river crossing controlled by Walder Frey, whose loyalty had been contingent on a marriage promise Robb Stark had broken. He knew the mechanism, guest right, the ancient covenant of hospitality that would lower every guard, steel every nerve into false comfort, make the slaughter possible. He knew the participants, Rose Bolton, whose correspondence with Lannister agents had been intercepted and decoded with embarrassing ease, had already committed to betrayal. He knew the date within a 3-day margin. He knew who would die. Robb Stark, Catelyn Tully Stark. The bulk of the Northern Army's command structure, eliminated in a single night of systematic murder that would effectively end the Northern Rebellion and consolidate Lannister control over the continent's political landscape. He knew all of it. He sat in a room in River Run. Varys's latest correspondence spread before him, and did what he always did when confronting information about preventable catastrophe. He built the decision tree. Option 1. Warn Robb Stark directly. Probable outcome. Robb believed him, refused to attend, survived. The Northern Rebellion continued. The Lannisters sought alternative methods of elimination. The Continental War extended by months or years, consuming additional thousands of lives, weakening every house's capacity to contribute forces to the defense against the White Walkers. Net result, individual lives saved, strategic position worsened. Option 2. Warn Robb Stark and provide evidence sufficient to expose Roose Bolton and Walder Frey publicly, forcing a political reckoning that restructured Northern alliances without the massacre. Mucker probable outcome, politically viable but required time he didn't have, and evidence that implicated Lannister involvement, which Tywin would deny and suppress with resources Bruce couldn't match in this timeline. Option 3, remove Roose Bolton and Walder Frey before the feast. He sat with option 3 for a long time. In Gotham, the line was absolute. He didn't kill, not because killing was always wrong in every conceivable philosophical framework. He'd examined the arguments, read the utilitarian calculus, understood the mathematics that said the Joker's death would save hundreds of lives per year of prevented recidivism. He didn't kill because he knew himself. He knew that the line, once crossed, didn't restore itself, that the second crossing was easier, and the third easier still, until the thing that had made him a protector rather than a predator had been quietly reasoned away, one justifiable exception at a time. He knew what he could become. He'd seen it in the Joker's eyes, the mirror the villain held up, the reflection that said, "You and I are one bad day apart." But this wasn't Gotham. There was no Commissioner Gordon to handle what he couldn't, no justice system, however flawed, to take custody of the guilty, no Arkham Asylum, inadequate, broken, but existent, to contain the irredeemable. There were two men who had agreed to commit premeditated mass murder against guests under their own roof, and there was no institution in Westeros equipped to stop them. And 31 days from now, Robb Stark would walk into a feast and not walk out. Bruce stood up, walked to the window, looked at the Riverlands landscape, rolling, scarred, dotted with the smoke of encampments and the distant movement of armies. He thought about what Varys had said in that first conversation. "I've never had anyone tell me the complete strategic situation of my own kingdom in under 2 minutes from inside a cell." He thought about what Daenerys had said. "You could help me take the Iron Throne." He thought about what he'd told her. "I could help you decide whether it's actually what you want." He thought about what Robb Stark had said, quiet and immovable. "I can't ask my men to stop fighting. Not yet." And he thought about the army of the dead, patient beyond any human patience, building in the north while Westeros bled itself toward the precise weakness that would make the final push effortless. He needed Robb Stark alive. And not for sentiment, for strategy. The Northern Lords followed Robb. Without Robb, the North fractured. A fractured North meant a fractured response to the White Walkers. The mathematics were unambiguous. He picked up a batarang, set it down, picked up a smoke pellet, set it down, picked up the parchment with Roose Bolton's intercepted correspondence, and read it again, slowly, the way he read crime scene evidence, looking for the thing that changed what was possible. He found it on the third reading. Bolton's arrangement with the Lannisters was transactional. He'd betrayed Robb for a promise of elevated standing in the post-Stark North, which meant Bolton's loyalty wasn't ideological, it was economic, which meant it was potentially renegotiable. So if the counteroffer was sufficiently compelling and the person making it sufficiently credible. Bruce reached for fresh parchment. He wrote 2 letters. The first to Roose Bolton, not a threat, not a moral argument, but a precise economic and strategic proposal outlining exactly what Bolton stood to gain from the survival of a weakened, politically indebted Robb Stark versus the uncertain rewards of Lannister promises that history suggested Lannisters were inconsistent about honoring. He included 3 pieces of intelligence about Lannister internal politics that Bolton couldn't have known and couldn't easily verify, but which were accurate enough to establish credibility. The second letter was to Walder Frey. This one was shorter. It contained no economic argument. It contained a single piece of information, specific, verifiable, devastating, about Walder Frey's second son and a financial arrangement that Frey had been concealing from his own household for 11 years. It contained no explicit threat. It didn't need to. He sealed both letters, arranged for delivery through channels that couldn't be traced to him. Then he sat back down and looked at the decision tree again. He hadn't crossed the line. Bolton and Frey would live. If his assessment of their characters was accurate, if they were rational actors responding to incentive structures rather than ideological commitments, the massacre would be avoided through manipulation rather than violence. If his assessment was wrong, Robb Stark died at the Twins in 31 days. He sat with that probability for a long time. The weight of it was different from Gotham weights, heavier in some ways, lighter in others. In Gotham, the stakes were the city. Here, the stakes were a continent, and beyond the continent, every living person south of the Wall. He thought about what he'd told Daenerys. What you do with the Iron Throne afterward is your business. He thought about what he hadn't told her, that he'd been watching her with the same careful attention he gave every powerful individual whose choices operated at civilizational scale, and that what he'd seen had left him genuinely uncertain in a way he hadn't expected. She wanted to be good. He believed that completely. She had suffered enough to understand suffering, survived enough to understand survival's cost, and she carried genuine compassion alongside the messianic certainty that made her dangerous. She also had dragons, and the absolute conviction of her own righteousness, and a throne waiting that she'd been promised since childhood. In Gotham, Bruce knew what happened to people with absolute conviction and absolute power, and a throne they believed was their destiny. He picked up his pen and wrote a third letter, this one to Varys. "Watch her," it said, "carefully. Tell me everything." The dragon glass came from Dragonstone's mines in quantities that exceeded every historical record Bruce had located in Castle Black's library. Daenerys had agreed to the mining operation with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who had decided that a man who wouldn't flatter her and wouldn't fear her was probably telling the truth. She provided labor, equipment, and access to caverns beneath the island fortress that contained more obsidian than the Night's Watch had deployed in 8 centuries combined. Bruce had spent 3 days in those caverns with a torch in his cowl's geological sensors, mapping deposit locations and calculating extraction yields, emerging with black dust on his armor and a production schedule that he handed to Daenerys' logistics coordinator with the flat certainty of someone who had already done the mathematics twice. The coordinator had looked at the schedule and then looked at Bruce with the expression people wore when they wanted to ask, "Who are you exactly?" but had already received enough answers to know the question was somehow beside the point. Weapon production began immediately. Not swords. Swords required trained smiths working extended timelines. Arrowheads, spearheads, dragon glass shards hafted into wooden handles with leather binding. Crude, effective, and manufacturable in volume by unskilled labor working in shifts. Bruce designed the template himself, optimized for production speed over elegance, and within 2 weeks, Dragonstone's Great Hall had been converted into a weapons manufactory, producing 300 dragon glass-tipped projectiles per day. He'd also been modifying his own equipment. The batarangs were a finite resource he couldn't replenish, but dragon glass, properly worked, could be shaped into throwing weapons with adequate aerodynamic properties if you understood the physics involved and had the materials science background to compensate for obsidian's brittleness. He'd spent 4 evenings working by candlelight in the castle's smithing area. He watched with open curiosity by a Dothraki bloodrider who had apparently decided that the armored foreigner chipping obsidian by firelight was the most interesting thing currently happening on the island. The result was functional rather than elegant. 12 dragon glass throwing blades, waited for his grip, shaped to his specifications. They wouldn't survive repeated impacts the way his batarangs did, but against whites, he didn't need them to survive repeated impacts. He needed them to kill on contact. He tested them in Dragonstone's courtyard on a cold morning, while Drogon watched from the castle walls with massive disinterest, and they performed within acceptable parameters. He was running weapons tests when the news arrived from the Riverlands. Rose Bolton had accepted the counteroffer. Varys's confirmation came in a cipher that took Bruce 40 minutes to decode, deliberately complex, which meant Varys considered the information sensitive enough to warrant maximum protection. Bolton had withdrawn from the Frey arrangement, citing concerns about Lannister reliability that mapped precisely to the intelligence Bruce had provided. The Red Wedding was not going to happen as this world's history had written it. Robb Stark would live. Bruce sat with the confirmation for a moment, examining what he felt about it, which was his habit when outcomes carried moral weight. He'd manipulated two men through leverage and economic incentive rather than killing them. He'd preserved the Northern Rebellion's leadership. He'd done it without crossing the line. He also knew that Rose Bolton was still Rose Bolton, calculating, disloyal, loyal only to Bolton, and that the man would find another arrangement eventually, another opportunity, and that Bruce had purchased Robb Stark's survival with a delay rather than a resolution. He filed that future problem. The more immediate problem arrived 2 days later in the form of Jon Snow, who came ashore at Dragonstone on a commandeered fishing boat, looking like a man who had run out of careful ways to say something and defaulted to simply saying it. "They're moving," Jon said. "The White Walkers." A ranging party came back. 2 men, barely alive. They said the dead are gathering, not scouting parties, massing, north of the lands of Always Winter, moving south. He looked at Bruce with eyes that had seen the whites in the forest and hadn't stopped seeing them since. "We have weeks, maybe less." Bruce had already been building toward this conclusion. The intelligence from Castle Black had been trending in this direction for a month. Accelerating Ranger contact, increased white activity, the electromagnetic field he'd been tracking through his Cal sensors, strengthening measurably. Something had changed in the north. Something had decided that the time for patience was finished. "Daenerys," Bruce said. She was in the war room within 10 minutes. Jon Snow had never met her before, and Bruce watched their first encounter with the attention he gave to any situation where two significant variables interacted for the first time. Cataloging the assessments each made of the other are on the immediate recalibrations, the specific quality of attention that two people paid each other when they recognized instinctively and simultaneously that the person across from them was not going to be simple. He didn't have time for whatever that was. He moved immediately to the map table. "The army of the dead is mobilizing for a southern push," he said. "We have a narrow window before they reach the wall in force. Once they breach, and they will breach, the wall cannot hold against the numbers we're projecting. Every army south of it is in their path." He laid his updated maps across the table. "We need a coordinated response. Northern ground forces to hold and channel. Dragon glass weapons distributed to every fighting unit, and aerial fire support." He looked at Daenerys. "Your dragons," he said, "all 3, auto-operating in coordinated attack patterns against concentrated white formations, supported by ground units with dragon glass projectiles targeting any White Walkers directing the assault." He paused. "I'll be on the ground." "That's suicide," Jon said. "It's tactics," Bruce said. "Aerial fire support without ground-level command coordination produces friendly fire casualties and missed command targets. I'll be on the ground identifying White Walker positions and directing dragon strikes." He looked at them both. "The Night King, whatever intelligence is directing this army, will be present. He has to be. The dead stop moving when their animating intelligence is destroyed. We've confirmed that with individual whites. The strategic question is whether it scales to the entire army." "You want to use us as bait," Daenerys said. Not accusingly, analytically. "I want to use the army as bait," Bruce said, "and end this in one engagement rather than a grinding campaign that destroys everything worth saving." He held her gaze. "Dragons hit the formations. Ground forces with dragon glass hold the flanks. I locate the Night King and eliminate the command structure." "Alone," Jon said. "I work better alone," Bruce said. It wasn't entirely true. He worked better with Oracle in his ear and Gordon holding the perimeter and Gotham's infrastructure behind him. But it was true enough for this situation, in this world, with these resources. What he didn't say, what he'd been sitting with for 3 days since the confirmation of the Army's movement, was that his explosive gel was down to 1 canister. His smoke pellets were exhausted. He had 12 dragon glass throwing blades, 16 standard batarangs, his armor, his mind, and whatever he could fabricate from local materials before the long night began. Against something that had existed since before the first men crossed the arm of Dorne. He looked at his dragon glass blades laid out on the map table beside the careful parchment topographies of the land north of Winterfell, and thought about what Alfred would say, and almost smiled. Terrifying odds, Master Bruce. Shall I prepare the medical bay? No medical bay, no Alfred, no Gotham, just the dark and the dead and the work. We move in 4 days, he said. I need every dragon glass weapon loaded onto ships tonight, and I need ravens sent to every lord between here and the wall. He looked up. Tell them the long night is beginning. Tell them it's time to stop fighting each other. He paused. Oh, tell them the Bat Night is going north. The long night came early, as Bruce had calculated it would. Not the mythological long night of legend. Not yet the years-long winter that the oldest stories described. But the darkness that rolled south from beyond the wall on the night the army of the dead breached Eastwatch by the Sea was absolute in the way that only purposeful darkness could be. A blackness that carried intention rather than merely the absence of light, pressing down on the frozen landscape like a hand over a candle. Bruce stood on the frozen field north of Winterfell and watched it come, and felt something he hadn't felt since the night his parents died. Not fear exactly, but its sophisticated cousin, the recognition of scale. Of confronting something whose parameters exceeded every contingency he'd prepared for, and proceeding anyway, because the alternative was unacceptable. The wall had held for 8,000 years. It had held for approximately 4 hours against the Night King riding a dead dragon. Bruce had not planned for a dead dragon. He filed that under critical intelligence failure and moved on, because the army of the dead was now south of the wall, and the plan had to adapt or everyone died. The coalition had come, incompletely, fractiously, with the reluctant urgency of people who had waited too long and known it, and come anyway. Robb Stark's forces from the north, alive, present, the Red Wedding's ghosts walking beside living men who didn't know how close they'd come to being the only ones in attendance. Jon Snow commanding the Night's Watch remnants and a force of free folk whose cooperation had required negotiations that Bruce had conducted through 3 translators and considerable patience. Daenerys' Unsullied holding the eastern flank in tight formations that Bruce had spent 2 weeks drilling in anti-white tactics. Don't pursue, hold ground, dragon glass on every spear. The Dothraki he'd placed in reserve, behind the main line, because their horses would break at first contact with the dead, and he needed the cavalry for a specific moment rather than a panicked rout. No Lannisters. Tywin had sent a raven that was diplomatically phrased and ultimately meaningless, which Bruce had anticipated and planned around. Daenerys was aloft on Drogon with her other 2 dragons, Rhaegal, Viserion, still living, still breathing fire, the aerial component of a coordinated plan that required timing and communication across a battlefield with no radio infrastructure. Communication was the problem he'd spent the most time solving and solved least satisfactorily. He'd developed a signal system, colored fire arrows from designated commanders indicating target zones for dragon strikes, a simple binary code that Daenerys had learned with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that complexity killed in combat. It would work under controlled conditions. Battlefields were not controlled conditions. He'd accepted that and built redundancy into every communication layer he could reach, and then accepted that it still wasn't enough and moved on. The dead crossed the field at a pace that was not running and not walking, but something between them. The mechanical fluency he'd first seen in the forest north of the wall scaled now to tens of thousands. A carpet of animated corpses moving with the horrible coordinated purpose of a single mind directing many bodies. No war cries, no drums, just the sound of frozen ground under dead feet and the distant, subsonic presence of whatever intelligence directed them. A cold pressure at the edge of perception that Bruce's cowl registered as the same anomalous electromagnetic field, massively amplified. The Night King was present, close, directing personally. Bruce had counted on that. He let the first wave hit the lines and held his position in the darkness to the east of the main engagement, moving parallel to the battle's edge, using the chaos as cover. His cowl's infrared was useless. The dead generated no heat. But the electromagnetic field had a directionality he'd been tracking for weeks, and its source was moving at the battle's rear, behind the white formations, elevated. Mounted, he'd theorized, which the dead dragon confirmed with catastrophic elegance. The dead dragon made the aerial component of his plan untenable. Daenerys couldn't make coordinated strike runs against ground targets while simultaneously avoiding an undead dragon that matched her own mounts in size and maneuverability. The signal system collapsed within the first 10 minutes as the aerial battle consumed all three living dragons' attention. He adapted. The ground plan remained viable if he could reach the Night King. The dead stopped when their commander was destroyed. He'd confirmed it with individual whites, theorized it scaled. If it scaled, when everything ended tonight. If it didn't scale, the coalition's ground forces would be overrun within hours. He moved through the chaos with the skills that had let him operate in Gotham for 15 years. Shadow, patience, the exploitation of attention directed elsewhere. The whites didn't respond to stealth the way human enemies did. They responded to proximity and movement, triggering on whatever sensory mechanism animated them. But they couldn't predict, couldn't anticipate, couldn't think. They were execution without strategy. He was strategy without execution capacity, moving through an army of pure execution. He made it 300 meters behind the main white line before the Night King saw him. The moment was unmistakable. The massive figure on dead horseback turning with the slow, in absolute certainty of something that had never been surprised in 8,000 years and wasn't surprised now. Blue eyes finding Bruce across 300 meters of frozen darkness with the precision of a targeting system. The Night King raised one hand. 12 whites peeled from the formation and turned toward Bruce with coordinated immediacy. He threw 3 dragon glass blades, precise, economical, each one finding a white's center mass. 3 dropped. 9 kept coming. He rolled under the grasping reach of the 4th, drove a dragon glass blade upward through what had been a man's jaw, felt the animating intelligence gutter, and die through the blade like a current breaking. 5 remaining. He was using his last explosive gel canister, he knew. 1 shot, 1 detonation. Make it count. He let them cluster. 3 meters, 2. Counter the detonation dropped 4, 1 remaining, a giant of a white in what had been a wildling's furs, and Bruce put his last dragon glass blade through its eye socket and stood breathing hard in the sudden silence of a small circle of destroyed dead. 8 dragon glass throwing blades remaining. No explosive gel. 12 batarangs. The Night King had watched this with the patient attention of something that had infinite replacements and infinite time. He descended from the dead horse, which meant he wanted this to be direct, personal, which meant Bruce's mind was already several steps ahead. He'd encountered something he considered worth his personal attention rather than simple numerical overwhelm, which meant Bruce had something the Night King wanted to assess. Use what they want against them. Oldest principle in asymmetric conflict. The Night King walked toward him, and Bruce stood his ground, and his mind was running faster than it had run since the cave in the mountains above Gotham, where Ra's al Ghul had first explained what Bruce could become if he let himself. The ice eyes, the absolute certainty, the 8,000 years of unbroken success. I've faced absolute certainty before, Bruce thought. It has a weakness. Everything with absolute certainty has the same weakness. It stops adapting. He reached into his cape and produced the one thing he'd been holding in reserve. Not a weapon, not a device. A signal mirror. Polished dragon glass. Flat, the size of his palm. Salvaged from the Dragonstone caves and worked to a reflective surface over 4 careful evenings. He angled it upward toward the aerial battle raging overhead. Caught Drogon's fire in the reflection. Shunner held it. 3 seconds. 4. The Night King was 15 meters away and closing, and Bruce held the mirror steady and thought about Alfred and Gordon and Gotham's skyline and the particular quality of light that came through the Batcave's cave mouth at dawn, gray and persistent and refusing to concede. Drogon saw the signal. The dragon broke from its engagement with the dead dragon, taking a wound across the flank that it ignored with the fury of something that had decided, and dove. The Night King turned. Bruce threw the mirror at his face, not to harm, to redirect attention for 1/2 second, the oldest trick in asymmetric conflict, and the fire came down like the end of something ancient and the beginning of something else, and the world went white and hot, and Bruce was already moving, rolling, my cape wrapping him in fire-resistant material that held for the 3 seconds he needed it to hold. And then silence. Real silence. Not the mechanical, purposeless silence of the dead. The silence of an army suddenly without instruction, without direction, without the animating intelligence that had moved it south for 8,000 years. Bruce lay on scorched frozen ground and looked up at a sky that was, for the first time since Eastwatch fell, showing stars. Familiar stars. Wrong stars. Not Gotham's stars, but stars. He stood up slowly, cataloging damage. Burns across the left shoulder where the cape's insulation had failed. 3 cracked ribs from the concussive force, the kind of comprehensive exhaustion that came from operating at full capacity for too long in conditions designed to destroy you. Around him, across the field, the dead were falling, all of them, simultaneously, dropping where they stood like puppets with cut strings, the blue light dying from 10,000 pairs of eyes in the span of a single breath, the army of the dead becoming simply the dead, still, silent, finished. The theory had scaled. Bruce stood in the middle of a field of fallen dead and breathed carefully around his cracked ribs and thought about the mathematics of it. The single command intelligence, the hierarchical dependency, the brittle elegance of a system that was devastatingly powerful and catastrophically vulnerable to decapitation, and how the Night King's 8,000 years of unbroken success had made him stop adapting, stop anticipating, stop imagining that something could surprise him. Absolute certainty. Same weakness every time. Jon Snow reached him first, emerging from the collapsed white lines with Ghost at his side, and looked at the field of fallen dead with an expression that hadn't found its shape yet, too large for any single emotion. "Is it over?" Jon said. Bruce looked north, at the darkness still hanging over the landscape beyond the ruined wall, the cold that would take weeks to recede, the infrastructure damage that would require years to rebuild, the political landscape that had been permanently altered by a night that half the surviving lords would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain. "This part," he said. The aftermath of the long night looked nothing like victory. Victory, in Bruce's experience, had a specific quality, a clean cessation, a before and after divided by a moment of resolution. What followed the Night King's fall was not that. It was the slow and grinding work of survival asserting itself over catastrophe, the living cataloging their losses in the gray dawn light, while the dead lay still around them, in numbers that would take weeks to burn and months to stop seeing in quiet moments. He spent the first hours doing triage, not medical triage, though he worked through that too, moving through the wounded with his trauma kit until it was exhausted, and then improvising from what the castle's maester had available. Strategic triage. The coalition was intact but fractured along lines that the shared crisis had papered over rather than resolved, and paper didn't survive the thaw. Robb Stark was alive and commanding his surviving forces with the quiet competence of someone who had learned overnight. Asha that the world was larger and darker and more genuinely dangerous than even a northern upbringing had suggested. He found Bruce at dawn, standing at the edge of the fallen white lines, and stood beside him for a long moment without speaking. "You saved us," Robb said finally. "The dragon saved you," Bruce said. "And the dragon glass. And every man who held the line when the mathematics said they should break." He paused. "I just pointed in the right direction." Robb looked at the field. Bolton withdrew from the fray arrangement. Did you know that was going to happen? I hoped it would. You arranged it. Bruce said nothing. Rob absorbed this with the gray, stark eyes that processed things thoroughly before displaying conclusions. You manipulated two of my bannermen to save my life without telling me. Yes, I should be angry about that. Probably, Bruce said. Rob looked at the fallen dead spread across the frost-burned field and said quietly, "Thank you." Then he walked back toward the surviving Northern commanders, and Bruce watched him go and thought that the young wolf might actually be exactly what this world needed, if the world had the sense to let him grow into it. Daenerys found him in Winterfell's Great Hall that evening, where he'd established a working space at one of the long tables. Fresh parchment, updated maps, the beginning of a post-engagement assessment that was already identifying 17 critical infrastructure and political problems requiring immediate attention. She looked at the maps with the careful attention she brought to everything strategic and sat across from him without waiting for an invitation, which he'd come to recognize as her default mode of occupying space. "Viserion is dead," she said. Her voice was controlled with the precision of someone who had decided that the grief was real and private and would be processed later, in full when there was time. "The Night King killed him before you, before the end." She looked at the table. "I watched him fall." Bruce said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and she wasn't asking for comfort. She was telling him something important about cost. "Drogon and Rhaegal survived," she said. "Injured, they'll recover." She looked up. "Your signal, with the mirror." "Man, that was what you'd planned from the beginning." "It was a contingency," Bruce said. "Contingencies only work when the primary plan fails." "Your primary plan failed." "Most primary plans do," he said. "The quality of a strategy isn't whether it survives first contact. It's whether you've built enough layers that failure at one level doesn't collapse everything." Daenerys looked at him with those violet eyes that were doing their analytical work. "You're going to tell me now that the Iron Throne question is still unresolved." "It was always unresolved," Bruce said. "The Night King made it temporarily irrelevant. Irrelevant doesn't mean resolved." "And what do you think I should do?" He looked at her directly. "I think you should spend 6 months listening before you do anything. Visit the kingdoms. Not as a conqueror, as someone trying to understand what 7 kingdoms of people actually need from whoever rules them." He held her gaze. "Dragons are the loudest argument anyone's ever made for a political position. Make sure the position deserves the argument." Daenerys was quiet for a long moment. "You still don't trust me?" "I trust your intentions," Bruce said. "I'm still assessing your judgment under conditions that don't involve existential crisis." "Those are different things," she almost smiled. "You're the most honest person I've met in Westeros." "I'm the only person in Westeros with no stake in flattering you," he said. She stood, smoothed her coat, looked at his maps one final time. "What will you do now?" It was the question he'd been avoiding examining directly, because examining it directly meant confronting what he already knew. There was no confirmed way home. Ra's al Ghul's dimensional tear had been a one-time event, unrepeatable without the specific Lazarus Pit configuration that existed in a universe he couldn't currently access. Varys's little birds had no intelligence on dimensional portals. Westeros had magic, but it was biological and elemental rather than technological, operating through bloodlines and ancient pacts and sacrifice rather than the scientific principles that might let him reverse engineer a path back. He was, with reasonable probability, here indefinitely. He looked at his maps, at the 17 critical problems, at the political landscape of a continent that had just survived an existential crisis and would spend the next decade either building something worth preserving or collapsing back into the patterns that had made the crisis possible. "There's work to do," he said. Varys found him late that night on Winterfell's battlements, standing in the cold dark, watching the torchlights of the surviving coalition's encampment spread across the fields below. Thousands of fires where there should have been tens of thousands, each fire representing the arithmetic of survival, the specific remainder left when catastrophic numbers were subtracted from what had existed before. "You're thinking about going home," Varys said, settling beside him with his hands folded, his breath misting in the cold. "Man, I'm thinking about the 17 immediate post-crisis problems that nobody else is currently thinking about. Bruce said. Varys looked at the fires. You could, leave. The immediate crisis is resolved. You've saved the continent from something that would have destroyed it. You've altered the political calculus in ways that will unfold for generations. He paused. By any measure, you've done what needed doing. Bolton is still Bolton, Bruce said. The Lannister succession is structurally unstable. The free folk integration north of the wall will fail without mediation. Daenerys needs 18 months of counsel before she makes decisions that will determine whether she becomes what she wants to be or what she's afraid she might be. He paused. And someone destroyed the wall. The boundary between the living and whatever still exists in the lands of always winter is gone. We don't know what that means long term. Varys looked at him with small, sharp eyes that had seen everything and lost very little of their precision. You've made yourself necessary, he said. Deliberately. Bruce didn't answer. Is that why you're staying? Varys pressed. Or is it because you've realized that whatever sent you here may not be able to send you back, and useful work is the only thing that makes that bearable? The fires burned below them. Somewhere in the darkness a raven called, one of Varys's little birds carrying information between the surviving fragments of a continent learning to breathe again. Bruce thought about Gotham, about Alfred's voice in his ear, Gordon's silhouette against the signal. The specific weight of the city's darkness and the specific quality of its light and the 15 years of work embedded in every rooftop and alley and shadow. He thought about it the way he thought about his parents, completely, without flinching, and then set it aside and looked at what was in front of him. Westeros, fractured, bloodied, reorganizing itself in the aftermath of a crisis it hadn't fully understood until it was over. Full of people making decisions that would determine whether the survival meant something or was simply a delay of different catastrophes. Full of work. Both, he said finally. Varys nodded, as though this was the answer he'd expected and respected. He turned to go, then paused. The lords are already telling stories about you, he said. The Bat Knight who came from nowhere. Who warned them and was ignored and saved them anyway. He glanced back. In 10 years it will be legend. In 50 it will be myth. In 100, I don't need a legend, Bruce said. No, Varys agreed, but Westeros might. He moved toward the stairwell. Good night, Lord Batman. Bruce stood on the battlements alone and looked at the fires in the dark beyond them. The ruined wall, a distant absence on the northern horizon. The cold pressing south with the patience of something that had not finished with this world regardless of whose army had fallen. Somewhere beyond the narrow sea, problems were compounding. Somewhere in the surviving kingdoms, the politics of survival were already curdling into the politics of advantage. Somewhere in the lands of always winter, in the darkness beyond the broken wall, a something ancient and cold was absorbing a defeat it had not experienced in 8 millennia and doing what ancient things did with unexpected information. Adapting. Bruce pulled his cape against the cold and turned from the battlements and walked back into Winterfell's torchlit corridors, already building the next contingency in his mind, already mapping the next 17 problems into priority order, already, despite everything, despite the distance and the impossibility and the 17 critical problems, doing what he had always done, working. In the shadows of the lands of always winter, something old and patient watched the fires of the living burn against the dark, and waited. Bruce Wayne had arrived in Westeros with 16 batarangs, 4 smoke pellets, and a mind that refused to accept unwinnable scenarios. He left the long night's battlefield with cracked ribs, exhausted equipment, and a continent that would argue about what had happened for generations. He had not crossed the line. Not quite, not completely, though he had walked along its edge in the candlelit room where he'd written letters designed to manipulate rather than destroy, and he knew himself well enough to know that the edge was where the danger lived. Westeros had given him something Gotham's villains never had, an enemy that was genuinely, categorically evil, with no origin story worth understanding, no trauma driving the cruelty, no redeemable humanity beneath the blue eyes. It had also given him something rarer, People worth protecting who didn't know yet what they were capable of becoming. He would stay. He would work. He would watch Daenerys and Council Rob and thread Varys's information through the gaps in a continent's political infrastructure until something more stable emerged. Not because he'd been asked, because the work was there and no one else was doing it. In Gotham, a city waited in darkness for a knight who wasn't coming back. In Westeros, the dark waited for everyone. And somewhere between those two truths, Bruce Wayne found the only thing he'd